Hi, welcome to our webinar, Valuing Victim Liaisons, Enhancing Victim Safety Through Family Violence Intervention Programs. My name is Alexis Champion, and I'm the Training Manager at the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I also have Jenny Asman and Nikki Lemeshka from the Georgia Commission on Family Violence, who will be, Jenny in particularly, will be presenting today as well. And then also joining us as a guest today is Susie McGee, our project manager here at the Coalition, just to share some of her experience as well. So we're super excited to have you guys here with us today. And I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to Jenny to get started today. So I just want to make sure that you guys are all able to see and hear this presentation. So if you can hear me now, please raise your hand, and you should find your little hand icon there on the right-hand side of your screen. And this will help you to get to know your control panel over there so you can see where all of these features are. So I see some hands going up. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to lower those hands. If you're having any technical problems or issues, it's really best to contact GoToWebinar directly, because I won't be aware of your troubles as we're facilitating the webinar. So this is their 1-800 number or their website for their support team. So you can reach out to either one of these if you're having trouble with either the visual or audio. If you're having trouble hearing us, if the audio is choppy for you, we also recommend that you call in for the audio through your phone rather than listening through your computer. Different internet speeds can affect the audio quality, and sometimes you'll get better audio over the phone. And you can find the dial-in information in that control panel on the right-hand side of your screen under audio. It should also be included in the email you received with the link to join today's webinar, and that email will have your access code and your PIN number. We encourage your questions and comments throughout the webinar today, and you can use the chat box there on your control panel to type in questions at any time. Those will not be seen by anyone but us here, the facilitators. We don't have a general chat box that everyone can see. So just know that if you do type a question, not everyone will see that, but we can certainly read questions out loud and share those with the group if you'd like us to. And at the end of the webinar, we will send you a copy of the slides from today's presentation, as well as a short evaluation. We definitely want to hear your feedback to know if you learned what you hope to learn today, and any other feedback you have from us for us about today's webinar. And you'll also notice that we'll be referring to these throughout the presentation, but you have access to 5 handouts that you can go ahead and download that we'll be mentioning today, but I will also attach those to this email to send out to you, so don't feel like you have to download those if you don't have a chance to during the presentation. So like I said, feel free to type in questions at any time. Other than that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jenny to get started.
All right. Thank you so much, Alexis. This is Jenny Asman with the Commission on Family Violence. I'm going to start off the webinar today talking a little bit more in depth about family violence intervention programs and sort of the Commission's role in certifying and monitoring our family violence intervention programs in Georgia, and then what the rules say specifically about FVIPs using victim liaisons and what those requirements are for using those victim liaisons in Georgia. So, briefly about our agency, we were created in 1992 by Georgia legislature, which means we're a state agency here in the state. Hopefully we've been in contact with you or interacted with you through several of our different initiatives that we have listed up here on the slide, whether it's from the task force work in your community or Fatality Review Project, maybe Stop Violence Against Women Day at the Capitol when we're working on legislative needs for our state, or maybe at our annual Family Violence Conference. Those are all examples of our initiatives across the state. And then, of course, FVIP certification and monitoring. So here is the code section for Georgia that specifically grants the department which is the Department of Community Supervision and the Georgia Commission on Family Violence, the authority to certify and monitor the family violence intervention programs in Georgia. It also grants us authority to promulgate, adopt, and enforce rules and regulations that are necessary to certify and monitor those programs, as well as establish standards and requirements regarding FVIP courses and the certification requirements for a program to be a certified family violence intervention program in Georgia. We work really closely with the Department of Community Supervision to carry out all of these things and this authority that we're granted. And the current rules that govern family violence intervention programs were adopted in 2004. And we also have 2 standard operating procedures that are currently active that were became active in 2005. All 3 of those documents are available for download on our website if you're interested in looking more in depth at the specific policies and procedures that have been put together. I did want to take this time to mention that we have proposed changes to those rules since the last time that they were adopted was in 2004. There's proposed changes out to update those rules to make them look different in a few different ways, and so you can find out more information about those proposed changes on our website as well. And if those are adopted, those would hopefully go into effect by the 1st of the year. So within the next few months, those will become active based on if they're approved or not as written.
And the website, both of our websites will be listed on the last slide of this presentation. And again, that will be emailed out to you, so you'll have access to that link. Great.
So currently in our state, we have around 125 certified family violence intervention programs that spans our entire state. And facilitating classes at those programs, we have about 250 approved facilitators. So that kind of gives you a sense of who's certified and just how many folks are really engaged in the work of family violence intervention programs in our state. There are about 10 judicial circuits that don't currently have a family violence intervention program, and so we're working closely with other service providers to try to activate and get some other programs that are down there to apply to be a certified family violence intervention program in Georgia. For each of those programs, their certification is renewed every 2 years. They're required to have continuing education credits to maintain that certification. And we have a process where they apply to keep active. And with that, we have and maintain a list of certified programs that we're updating regularly based on new programs that we approve or programs that become inactive, which you can download on our website, which is listed there on the slide as well. What we've also done is try to break those lists up into specific classes that we know of that are offered at this program. So we also have lists of classes that are offered for women, for folks who identify as LGBT, and then classes that are offered in other languages as well. We definitely conduct site visits regularly throughout the year. Those are scheduled and unscheduled. And so with that process, we're able to reach roughly about 30% of programs are monitored each year with a site visit by our program. And so we're trying to get out and about to look and see how those programs are maintaining those policies and procedures that are required in the rules and what kind of support and guidance that they need that we can help provide as a commission. And so here is the code section to give us a sense of who is attending these FVIP classes. And so this code section, which was effective July 1st, 2003, specifically outlines who should be ordered to attend a family violence intervention program in Georgia. And so as you can see, whenever a defendant is being sentenced or there's a revocation of probation for an offense involving family violence, or any time a protective order against family violence is being imposed, the court should be ordering that person to participate in a family violence intervention program unless the court determines and states on the record why participation in such a program is not appropriate. So I went ahead and pulled those numbers for 2016 from GBI just to give us a sense of, what is the potential scope of impact of that legislation. And so as you can see here in 2016, 20,508 family violence arrests occurred in Georgia in that year. Close to 5,000 12-month temporary protective orders were issued in 2016. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Certainly that could be the same person who was arrested as well as a respondent in a TPO. But it can give more of a context to definitely the impact that these programs could have if they're being sentenced to complete FVIP in Georgia. What I also pulled is the number of FVIP participants that were reported to the commission in a one-year period. So this number up on your screen, the 4,182, are the number of participants that were reported to the commission between July 1, 2017 and June 30th in 2018. So not exactly the same years, but also gives you a sense of the number of participants that we're seeing come through FVIPs that are being reported to the commission. This slide is just a general overview of what the rules outline for programs. We're not going to go into depth about everything that the rules say today, but I wanted to just let you know what is addressed in the rules if you're interested in learning more about some of the requirements to be a certified family violence intervention program. So you can see there are certain curriculum requirements, there's program structure, we have certain requirements that the programs must have for any batterer who enrolls in that program, and then of course training, that CEU training that's required for FVIPs. We have a process that is dictated in the rules of how to go about getting that training approved for CEUs. But we're going to really be focusing on the victim liaison component today. And then I just pulled out a few highlights. Hopefully folks on the call are familiar with FVIP and victim liaison, but just in case, these are some things to know about that are pretty important in terms of understanding basic FVIP. So these are 24-week educational programs that are being conducted in these certified programs. The 24 weeks must be completed within 27 weeks, which allows a participant up to 3 absences, and participants are supposed to be attending class on a weekly basis. Those classes are to be of the same gender, so those participants are the same gender. Those participants are required to sign a contract and make sure that they follow all class rules that are in place. They also have to pay a state fee as well as the victim liaison fee. A lot of times that's included in that contract that they sign, and these FVIP programs are passing those fees on down to those participants so that they're paying for those fees. Victims are not allowed to participate in class in any way. And participants in family violence intervention programs do not have confidentiality like some other group work and classes that we know exist in communities. FVIPs in particular, those participants do not have confidentiality, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation today as well. And then just briefly, these are a list of goals of family violence intervention programs, sort of what we're hoping and striving to achieve through this process of ordering and sentencing these participants to complete this program. And we really think that the rules provide the structure that's needed to guide this process of change and to support facilitators in the classroom to create an environment where this level of change can occur. So you'll see some of the things up here that we're hoping happen through family violence intervention programs are that folks who are using violence take responsibility for their abuse, that they're able to overcome the minimizing, denying, and blaming that we know is inherent in abusive behaviors, really working on changing their belief system that grants them the authority or belief that it's okay to use violence and power and control in their relationships, and creating a space not only where participants are being held accountable by a facilitator and through the process of just being required to attend, but that there's some peer-to-peer feedback and accountability happening, which really can change those belief systems and sort of that culture that can lead to that long-lasting change that we want to achieve through the family violence intervention program. And so the victim liaison requirement that we have for family violence intervention programs in Georgia is actually pretty unique to our state and is a unique opportunity as well to reach a group of victims that we may not always be able to have access to, or who may not be reaching out to domestic violence programs for advocacy and assistance and safety planning and for services. And so it's an opportunity which can be really beneficial, particularly for victims who may still be living with their abusive partner. And so it's just something that I wanted to draw attention to, that this isn't something that's happening with all batterer intervention programs across the United States. From our work and our training and our connection with national folks, this is a pretty unique component in Georgia, and we'll talk more about the opportunity that affords again later on this afternoon. But specifically around the rules is that FVIPs are required to have a victim liaison. They're required to have a contract with a program to provide this victim liaison responsibility. They're required to have that contract with CJCC certified program. So typically those are domestic violence programs providing shelter, or it can be an approved organization that we have been approved to provide those services. So on rare opportunities, we are approached to deviate from the CJCC certified program and use another victim service agency or organization in a community, and so we have a process for that. With that, FVIPs are required to pay those victim liaisons for their services per participant. So with each participant that is sent to a victim liaison to make a contact with that victim, that payment is supposed to be made for that service. The rules also briefly outline the role of a victim liaison and sort of what a victim liaison will do. And so victim liaisons will contact the victim, inform the victim of the enrollment of the participant in that FVIP program, explain what the program is, how long it is, what the rules of the program are, what the focus of a family violence intervention program is, answer any questions that folks may have about that, and make sure to explain, that's supposed to say limitations, sorry, not imitations, explain the limitations of those programs, that does not ensure her safety, right? So a participant in completing or attending classes will never ensure her safety, and that you as a victim liaison or the domestic violence program will always be there to safety plan and help connect with services should anything concerning come up, and really kind of open that dialogue and make sure that she's aware that those services are available in the community.
And this is Alexis adding that, this is really why we're here today having this webinar, is because what we've heard from a lot of programs is that you all may not have an awareness that this is a requirement that FVIPs have. And so if you're getting phone calls from FVIPs saying, hey, we want to contract with you to be our victim liaison, this is why, and what you'll be learning during the rest of this webinar is what that means and what that work looks like.
Yeah. Thanks, exactly. And what we've learned too, that is what I really like about the way this is laid out is that folks are able to maintain their expertise, right? So we don't, in some states, the FVIP facilitators are the ones making that contact with victims to safety plan with them. And so we're able to, in Georgia, make sure or have a system in place where advocates at the DV program who are already experts in all of the safety planning and local resources and services and being able to make those referrals, those are the folks making the contact with victims in Georgia. So with that, the rules specifically outline the minimum level of contact that FVIPs must have with victim liaisons regarding participant enrollment, termination, and completion. And so within 5 working days of a participant enrolling in an FVIP program, they are to be notifying their victim liaison and making sure that they have the participant's name and information, as well as the victim's name and information. Within 2 working days of a participant being terminated, FVIPs are to contact the victim liaison and notify the victim liaison of that termination. And then within 4 working days of a participant completing FVIP, the FVIP is supposed to notify the victim liaison of that completion. And the expectation is that at each of those points of contact, the victim liaison would then notify the victim of updates around that. So that's when that call would be made to talk with the victim about the enrollment and what it means and what it looks like, and about safety planning. After termination, that again, a phone call would be made to notify of termination and check in around safety planning and needs of the victim might have, and then for completion as well. And so that's why that contact is required. And on the next slide, you'll see this is the bare minimum of what you should be receiving from your family violence intervention program. So on the left side of the screen, the initial victim contact request form. This is what is required at a minimum of family violence intervention programs to be sending to victim liaisons. Programs are allowed to deviate from this form as long as it includes at least this amount of information. We've seen programs who have developed more in-depth and more detailed forms that are used. But definitely take a look and see. If you're not receiving this level of detail, you can download this specific form off of our website. And we've also provided one of the attachments is a more detailed form that you're also welcome to use and integrate into your work if needed. And then on the right side of your screen, this is not a requirement, but it is a helpful tool to think about if you're not already using something like this, around how are you tracking or simplifying this notification process whenever there are changes in what's happening with the participant, if the facilitator has learned of something is going on at home or something's changed in the relationship. Just sort of tracking the communication between FVIP and victim liaison, and then also victim liaison and victim. So it can be a helpful tool as well. I wanted to include.
And Jenny, while you were going over these forms, we had a question come in about and you did explain this, are all of the programs required to use this form? And the answer is no, as long as the form that they are using captures this information in some way. But then that same person said that they get this form, but oftentimes a lot of this information is missing. And so I just wanted to let you guys know, since this question was coming up now, that that's something we will be talking about in the next section when we talk about actual victim liaison work and what that looks like. That's a frequent challenge that comes up. So I just wanted to acknowledge that many of you may be receiving this form, but it's not completely filled out, and we'll talk about that a little bit, the best ways to address that.
Great. All right, so these are some additional contacts that FVIPs may have with their victim liaison outside of the sort of minimum requirements around enrollment, completion or termination. So safety checks is something where you might be in contact with your FVIP around checking in on a victim, making something may have come up in class, maybe a participant said something. So this could be something that actually an FVIP requests happen based on what's being disclosed in class, or a safety check is something that victim liaisons can initiate on their own as sort of part of their process and their internal procedures of how they and how often they choose to engage and contact victims of those participants who are currently enrolled in FVIP classes. A leave of absence request is something else where you may be contacted by an FVIP regarding your input, and this is because they are required to consult with the victim liaison prior to approving a leave of absence. And so something just to know about is this is a leave of absence. It's required that this is approved prior to a fourth absence, because a fourth absence is supposed to result in a termination. But, these conversations are really important, and, life does happen. And so there are some times where a leave of absence would be something that you might recommend and might, your consultation might say this doesn't cause any harm or risk necessarily to the victim based on conversations with the victim. So some things to consider if you are contacted around a leave of absence is, why is the leave of absence being requested? What's happening? What's changed in the life of the participant? What's the participant's participation and engagement in class kind of looked like up to this point? Were there any recent acts of violence that have occurred? Is the participant trying to avoid some sort of accountability? And, again, what's the victim's perspective on the leave of absence? And does the victim need any additional safety planning during the leave of absence? So just some questions to consider if you are contacted around that. And we're always here as well as a commission to help think through some of that or talk through some concerns that might come up through that request. And very similar around participant transferring programs. Some of those same questions can guide whether, that consultation that you're contacted about, sort of what that looks like. We want to know the victim's perspective on that because we've had instances in the past where the participant wants to transfer classes, and we found out that the victim had recently moved to the location where they wanted to transfer classes. And so just thinking through some of that and making sure that we're kind of following up and getting the victim's perspective and looking at sort of what's been happening with that participant and what's been happening in class. So those are some additional points of contact you might have with FVIPs beyond the original slide we just went over. And then there's a few more on the next slide to go through. The first one is recent acts of violence. So also in the rules, FVIPs are required to notify victim liaisons if the participant discloses a recent act of violence, or if the victim happens to contact the FVIP directly and report a recent act of violence. That is supposed to be then told to you as a victim liaison or to the victim liaison. A duty to warn. You should be notified immediately if an FVIP has reason to believe that the victim is at risk or in danger of immediate physical harm. And so that's the only time that an FVIP is allowed to contact a victim directly. And then as soon as they hang up with that victim, they are to call the victim liaison and let that victim liaison know that they made that contact. And so that's outlined in our standard operating procedures pretty clearly and sort of what that means and what that looks like. So that's another contact you might have. And then the last one is consultation and feedback. And so this is a contact that we encourage to happen in an ongoing manner at any time, where victim liaisons and FVIPs are talking about best practices, where victim liaisons are going to site visits, where they are observing classes, and inviting FVIPs to trainings that they're doing in the community, vice versa, really creating an atmosphere where FVIP is being informed by victim advocacy and victim safety, and that those relationships are being developed. And so those are encouraged in our standard operating procedures, where FVIPs are supposed to be reaching out and inviting their victim liaisons to provide this type of consultation and feedback. So that's another form of contact we hope that you're having. And if not, we're going to talk about some strategies and ways that we can hopefully bolster that in your community with your FVIP program. So the next slide is just, again, I mentioned earlier around confidentiality. The rules are really explicit. There is no confidentiality for FVIP participants. They are all required to sign a release of information, and FVIPs are explicitly expected to share information about participants with victim liaisons. So if you have questions about a participant in class based on your conversations with victims around their safety, those FVIPs are expected to share that information with you. But for victims do have confidentiality, and so that's not a two-way street. So victim liaisons are not expected to and should not share information about the victim without explicit written permission of the victim. And those standard operating procedures around victim contact are pretty clear about what that should look like and how explicit that should be, and some other strategies around obtaining that kind of permission to share anything with the FVIP facilitator, FVIP program from a victim. But what we do encourage is general domestic violence information to help FVIPs in designing of their class. So if there's a common theme that's coming up with victims and around their safety or concerns, sharing really generalized information, as long as it's, disguised enough and shared in a careful way to help guide some of the conversations in a classroom, that is allowed and encouraged and can be done really well, but with, maybe just require some safety, not planning, but thinking through the safety concerns to make sure we don't potentially share any information that could get back to a participant that a victim shared that with a victim liaison.
And I'll just add from my experience here that sometimes it gets a little confusing with the FVIPs, because you may be working with an FVIP that is also a counseling center, for example. They may have both types of services that they offer, multiple services that they offer. And so while they would be following confidentiality that any therapist would follow for a support group or a therapy session, just because they have that umbrella organization, again, the confidentiality does not apply to FVIP participants. And so that doesn't, that should be across the board. So if that's something that you're encountering some challenges with, we can certainly provide more support around that at the commission especially.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and so this is part of that is included in our site visit process. So I just included a few slides just so you know what we're doing with our site visit process and how we also might be contacting you. And so as I mentioned earlier, these are scheduled or unscheduled. So sometimes they're pop-up and sometimes folks know we're coming. And they include 3 levels of the site visit. So we have the file review, where we're looking at their files. We observe a class, and then we also have collateral contact. So in our file review, that's where we try to catch some of those, the language around confidentiality, and make sure that we're also making it very clear and catching that so FVIPs are aware that doesn't apply to their FVIP classes and participants. And then with our collateral contact, we're making phone calls to victim liaisons as well as probation officers to see how those relationships are looking, how notification is going, and just try to get a sense of what's happening in the community outside of the FVIP program that we're certifying and monitoring, that we can bring back with us into ongoing trainings that we're doing with FVIPs. So if you haven't already, Meredith Stepp, our compliance coordinator, is doing a site visit of a program where you are the victim liaison. It's very likely she will reach out to you by phone or email, try to set up a time to talk with you about your program and how notification around termination and completion and enrollment is going. And that's because those are some of our common deficiencies that we're finding on those site visits, is that victim liaisons are not being notified at all about completions or terminations of participants, or they're being notified outside of those required time frames. And then the same for enrollment. Either victim liaisons are not being notified at all about participants in FVIP programs or outside of those required timelines. And those required timelines are really important to us in terms of victim safety. If a participant is completing or terminating, we want to make sure those victims know about that. And then we also, on enrollment, want to make sure that victims are aware of services and safety planning and sort of what to expect with this enrollment in the FVIP program. So wanted to share that with you, that this is something that we're finding repeatedly. Also why we wanted to have this webinar today to talk about the importance of this piece, and that with that, those findings, we require programs to tell us and put down in policy for their program exactly how they plan to meet these requirements moving forward. Some other common deficiencies that I wanted to highlight were that programs have been allowing participants to miss more than 3 classes without terminating them. And that feels like a victim safety concern as well, especially when victims a lot of times think that their partner or the participant is going to be at this certain place for 90 minutes every week, and then they're not, and they're allowed to miss those classes without sort of any consequences. Is something that is concerning for us when we do a site visit. And then, of course, the use of a non-approved FVIP facilitator. So again, something for victim liaisons to be aware of and know who is certified or approved to facilitate classes at your program. Is that who you're talking with? Is that who you're communicating with? Is that who is doing the paperwork? And just sort of getting familiar with who is actually a part of the FVIP program, and who is the approved person at that program who should be facilitating classes is something to be aware of. And so all of these we take really seriously with our certification and monitoring and our ongoing training with family violence intervention programs in Georgia.
That's a great point, that some FVIPs may have an administrative staff person who is responsible for the paperwork end of things, and that person may not be the actual facilitator. And so, getting to know the staff of the program that you're connected to, the difference in those roles and who those people are.
Exactly, yeah. You could be interacting with one person who we have a lot of smaller programs where it's a sort of a one-person show who kind of does it all, who's the owner, operator, facilitator, as well as folks who are much larger.
Right.
It's a much bigger program, and so that can look really different. And there can be several folks kind of with their hands in the programmatic part beyond just facilitating the classes. All right, and then just the last slide I had here was just wanted to just acknowledge the staff that we have who are working to do all of this certification and monitoring work and supporting and training FVIPs at the commission. So we have Jamila Farrell on the top left. She is our certification coordinator at the commission. Then we have on the top right, that's Meredith Stepp. She's our compliance coordinator. She's out there doing those site visits. Down on the bottom left is our director, Jennifer Thomas, and then that's me there on the other bottom right. And then for Department of Community Supervision, that's our commissioner, Michael Nail. He oversees all of our notice of deficiencies with our site visits and signs all of them. And then that bottom photo is Mark Guzzi. He's our legal counsel at the Department of Community Supervision, who is helping us also implement and make sure those rules are being followed.
For those that are on the call that may not be aware, the reason that there is this connection with the Department of Community Supervision is because the commission is administratively attached to DCS. So that's why you're hearing both of these agencies at the same time.
Thank you, Nikki. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to shift gears here now and talk more specifically about the role of victim liaison and some best practices. But before we do that, I just wanted to check and see if anyone had any questions for Jenny or Nikki, specifically about sort of the commission's side of this work in doing those site visits and monitoring and certifying the family violence intervention programs. And if there's any questions that come up about this part of it even later on, of course, feel free to type those into your chat box at any time. Okay, so this is Alexis talking from the Coalition. I'm going to take us now into the next section on best practices for victim liaison work. So once you've signed that contract and you've agreed to be this role for a family violence intervention program, what does that mean? So first we have a little poll for you guys. So I'm going to launch this here, and what we want to know is, do you think that FVIPs work? So take a minute to look at that. Do you believe, and what I mean by work is, do you think that they are effective in actually affecting change in the beliefs and the behaviors of people who choose to batter their partners. To give you just a little bit more time to select your answer. Okay, so we've got most folks having voted, and it looks like 31% of you said, yes, I do believe that these programs work. 8% of you said, no, I don't think batters ever change. And 62% of you said, sometimes it depends. And that's why I put it depends, because what does it depend on? It could depend on a lot of different factors, right? So thank you for sharing that. We're going to talk a little bit about why this question is important if you're doing victim liaison work in your community. So I'm going to go ahead and close that poll, and we'll come back to this in just a little bit. So as Jenny mentioned this as at the beginning, but why is victim liaison work unique? What is really special about this that's kind of different from some of the other advocacy or most of the other advocacy work that we do in our programs? The first big difference is that we are initiating contact with the survivor instead of the other way around. Most of the time, the point of access for our services is through our 24-hour crisis lines or someone coming into the courthouse to file for a protective order, but they are initiating contact. There are a few programs around the state who may be initiating contact in other ways, getting police reports and reaching out to victims in police reports. But this victim liaison role, this initiating contact with survivors, has been in place for years now and is one of the only ways in which we are initiating that contact. And as Jenny explained, the benefit of this is that we may be reaching people who wouldn't otherwise ever either know about or think to contact a domestic violence program. The victim liaison may have potential insight into the abuser that we also don't usually get through the FVIPs. So, if the FVIP facilitator is sharing concerns or thoughts about the abuser's participation in the class, that's a perspective that we rarely ever have. Is any idea of the thought process or what's going on with that abusive partner? This is also an excellent opportunity to build community relationships, and I can't overemphasize the importance of this. And this is really what the focus of our conversation is going to be on today, is building these relationships. To touch back to that question we just asked you about, do you believe the FVIPs are effective? Part of that it depends piece is how the community works with FVIPs. So most FVIPs are following a model that's called a coordinated community response, and a lot of the effectiveness depends on other systems holding the batterer accountable. So having judges that are ordering them to FVIPs if they have been arrested for family violence or if they are TPO respondents, having probation officers who are revoking probation if they're not attending, if they're not complying with the rules. Those things all have a key part in the effectiveness of these programs. And so the victim liaison has a unique opportunity to connect with all of these systems, not just the facilitator of the class, but these other pieces as well, through attending your community task force meetings and just going out and engaging with these different folks and asking these questions. And it just, for me, working as an advocate, I know how many times do we hear survivors say, I don't want to end the relationship, I just want the abuse to stop. I would get calls to the crisis line saying, I'm safe, I'm fine right now. What can you do for him? What help is there for my partner? And I say him, we know that it's not always the men who are the aggressors. So I just want to acknowledge that. But many times the survivors we're working with want help for their abusive partner, and they don't know where to get it. And I would often be stuck saying, well, we're here to help you. We're not here to help that person. But the FVIP is there to provide that instruction, and it's not just about telling them what not to do. It's also about teaching them what healthy relationships look like. Many of the curricula that the FVIPs use include that, so that's an important component. This can be an answer to that question. And so, again, a big part of the role of the victim liaison is to provide that connection. So helping the survivor to understand what's happening in the FVIP. And I will say here that it's not that the facilitator is going to give the victim liaison a daily report of he said this and he did that and he shared this and he shared that. That's not going to happen. It's more about if, again, it triggers that duty to warn where he's making threats or saying something particularly alarming. But the victim liaison should absolutely know what happens in the class, generally speaking. Be familiar with the curriculum. Do they follow the curriculum and just have people come in and start wherever they're at? Or do they pick different topics depending on who's there in the class? These are all things that the more you can get to know the program, the more you'll be better prepared to explain to a survivor what's going on in the class, what they might be talking about that may be challenging, and that may create safety concerns for that survivor. Especially important that you're providing that safety planning and support. Safety planning around attending the classes. We've mentioned several times now that if we know that this person is enrolled in this class and that this class is following the rules and not allowing more than 3 absences, this is a great piece to safety plan around, that there's 90 minutes a week that the perpetrator is going to be in this class, and the victim may be able to use that time to attend their own appointments, even if it's to see a therapist or visit a friend that they never get to see for emotional support. So that can be included in the safety planning. The other thing you're there to do is just to explain and offer options and services, not just the ones that your program offers, but other ones that you feel may be beneficial to that person. And again, to discuss the risks and benefits of the abuser's participation in the FVIP. So ideally, the program and the curriculum will help the perpetrator to recognize their use of power and control in their relationship and change that. But of course, real world says not everybody likes to be challenged on their beliefs, and there can be some backlash from this, especially at the beginning. And I know from my experience going out and observing FVIPs, I got to where I could kind of tell who was there, who'd only been in that class for 2 or 3 weeks, and who'd been there for 20. And the difference was pretty remarkable. And so being able, again, the more you get to know the class, the more you observe the classes, the more you'll get a sense of that too, and you can talk with the victim about what to expect, what to anticipate, and not to expect change overnight, to be prepared that there may be, each perpetrator is different, and the victim knows that perpetrator better than anyone usually, and can anticipate how that particular person may respond, because they're being required to participate in these classes. And so especially at the beginning, there may be a rocky start that there should be some safety planning around. So our second poll for today is we want to know if you have had the chance to actually go out and observe a class. So I'm going to launch this poll. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's okay if you haven't been to the class. We're just curious. We'd like to get a sense of how many of you have had the chance to do this. You also have the option if you're planning on going soon but just haven't had a chance to yet, you can check that answer as well. keep this open for just another few seconds. Go ahead and weigh in if you haven't yet. So it's looking like about a quarter of you, a little over 27% have attended a class. 73% said no, you haven't attended a class. And no one has said that they haven't but are planning on going. One person is sharing in the chat box that they're working right now on setting up meetings with all of their FVIPs to go over reports, classes, etc. That's great. So I'm actually really happy to see these results, because that means that hopefully this webinar will give you some information that's really helpful to encourage you to get out there and observe those classes. I really can't tell you, I was a little honestly intimidated at first to go out. I'm thinking, I'm going to be in a room full of batterers. Like, that's not something we typically experience. And it was a little scary. But it's one of the most fascinating experiences I've had as an advocate. It's worth going, and it will truly help you to know and appreciate what the facilitators are doing out there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So let's talk a little bit about observing the class and what that process looks like. So just like any relationship, we want to be respectful and mindful of the facilitators in going out and doing this. So while the commission is there in this compliance role and they can do these pop-up visits, that's not really ideal for you as the victim liaison. The best practice is to talk to the FVIP in advance. And what I've said here is so that they can pick the best time. And what that means is sometimes they may have certain dynamics going on with participants in the course where they're like, we've got a bunch of new folks and it could be really disruptive to building this trust with them, to have a new person coming in and observing. Because even though you're not there to observe the participants, they don't always really fully understand that. So we want to respect the facilitator's wishes and opinion in that instance. So talking to them in advance, talking about when the best time would be, and then doing some safety planning around attending. So the facilitator should not be telling the participants who you are. You can make up whatever you want to make up. I usually had some generic thing that I was from the state and that I was there to observe the facilitator, not the participant. So the facilitator should be making that clear, that you're not there to check up on them, on the participants. And to do some basic safety planning around arriving and leaving. I would usually get there well before the class started, and kind of be in my seat, tucked away. I wouldn't sit if there was a table everybody was sitting at, I wouldn't sit at that table. I would sit back or kind of separate myself physically a little bit from the space, just because, as you see here, another point to remember is that the victim liaison should not be participating in class discussion or really participating in the classes in any way. And I will tell you, it was very rare, but I did have one facilitator ask me a question. You're a woman, what do you think about such and such? And that's not what your role is there. You should just be observing only. And so again, going back to that relationship piece, just have a chat with them afterwards about, hey, I really don't feel comfortable participating in any class discussion, if that's okay. I'm just leaving it at that, unless it happens more than once, but that's unusual. Another great thing to do is that if this is a bigger program with more than one facilitator, and I would say most of them do have at least two, that you want to try to get to observe everyone, because they'll have different styles, just like support group facilitators have different styles and approaches. And so that'll just, again, help you to get to know the program and how that works. And then ideally, you want to be providing feedback and setting aside time, if not right after the class, because sometimes they're at night, they might not be getting done until 9 p.m., but follow up, have a chat with the facilitator about what you saw. If you have questions about things that were coming up, things that participants were saying, your perspective on that class can be incredibly helpful to the facilitator. And I have gotten to know some really amazing facilitators who really valued my feedback and opinions and wanted to hear what I had to say about the class and really took that to heart. And I think that's true for most of them, that they want to hear your thoughts on that. And so another important part of this relationship building is getting to know the facilitators in the program, even beyond going in and just observing the classes. That's a pretty formal way to interact, and there can be, to a certain extent, a power dynamic there, that even though the victim liaison is not the monitor, you're not from the commission, you're not there to sort of check up on them, it's still kind of a formal process. So find other ways to build the relationship with your FVIP, through having a lunch meeting or just calling and checking in and seeing how they're doing. Inviting them to training, that's a huge way to build relationships. It's not to say that any training you invite them to will necessarily be approved, but FVIP facilitators are required to get so many training hours a year by the commission as a part of their certification. And it's not, you won't necessarily know if a training you're inviting them to has been approved by the commission, but you could certainly check and see. But they're eager for training. They're eager for information. They often don't get invited to the same tables that domestic violence programs are at. They kind of get left out sometimes of our movement and our work. And so bring them to the table, invite them to your meetings. They are required to attend so many community meetings, especially task force meetings, a year. So they should be going to those already, but there may be other collaborative groups that you're a part of that they are not aware of. And I think that's a great way to build that relationship and have a great way for them to learn more about your end of the work, working with victims and hearing that victim voice. It's really incredibly challenging for FVIP facilitators. Most of them are hearing batterers over and over and over again, doing what batterers do, minimizing, denying, blaming. And so in order for facilitators to stay present in the work of challenging these beliefs and behaviors, they need to be tapping in and hearing the victim side of things. And you're a liaison for the victim. You're also a liaison for that FVIP facilitator and bringing them to that table and creating those opportunities for them to do that. And so just finding ways to communicate regularly. One thing to consider is that some domestic violence programs may have multiple staff people who are doing the victim liaison work. I know I've worked at a program where we would get a stack of those forms we showed you earlier, and whoever was there that day would pick them up and make the contact. So it wasn't necessarily always the same person or only one victim liaison. But I would encourage you to consider who has the most availability and consistency to be a point person if there are particular challenges or to do this relationship building, so that the FVIP can really get to know that person and feel like they have one person whose name they know that they can pick up the phone and call if they need to. And so I just want to pause for a second and see if anybody has questions. Also, even if you don't have a question, if you've done some of these things, I'd love to hear your examples of how you've built relationship with your FVIPs. What are things you've done that have really worked for you or your program, or if there are challenge areas you're having around any of the things we're talking about. Again, I won't share your name, so but just really welcome your thoughts and feedback on all of this. So some challenges and conflicts that may come up in building relationships. So we mentioned this earlier, but not having enough or having invalid victim contact information. Maybe a challenge that's coming up for you is you're getting those forms faxed on time, but a lot of those lines are blank. There may be challenges around concerns about abuser behavior. Either the facilitator is not notifying you about concerning behavior. And this may be something that you're not going to know unless you're there observing the class. But one example of this is you may be hearing from the victim, if you're in touch with the victim, that the partner is coming home and talking about class and saying, well, this, and that, that would be a great reason to contact the facilitator and say, with, of course, the victim's permission. So going back to that confidentiality, just like any client of yours, you have to get express written permission to release any information. So you'd want to talk with the victim about the pros and cons of doing that. But you could do a hypothetical. Say, hypothetically speaking, let's say you had a participant who was showing up in class and saying or doing X, Y, or Z. How would you handle that? I have a question coming up. I'm going to check that for just a second. Someone's asking for us to email the handouts, and we absolutely will. In the email that I send out after the webinar, we'll include all the sample forms that we're sharing with you today, as well as a copy of these slides and the links to our websites and the evaluation. We definitely want to hear back from you. So another challenge that you may be experiencing in your community is the community and court systems, that coordinated community response piece. Are abusers being referred to FVIPs? And I've heard all kinds of tough situations where, in certain jurisdictions, there may be a judge who knows of an anger management class and doesn't understand the difference between anger management and FVIP. And so isn't sending TPO respondents or those charged with family violence to the FVIP. And so just considering ways that you can address that, reaching out to your executive director to get some help in navigating those systems, because it's never easy to tell judges what to do, right? So, but the FVIP would appreciate your support in helping that, because they depend on participants being enrolled in their programs to thrive as a program. Another challenge is, again, around that confidentiality issue. So just being really clear in your communication with FVIPs about your confidentiality requirements. So explaining that this isn't just you being difficult or not wanting to help them. I think some newer facilitators may say, well, gosh, it'd be really helpful for me to know what the victim is thinking or feeling about the situation. Why can't you share this information with me? And it's just important to, explain, because they're not working in the same systems we are, so they don't understand the confidentiality requirements always around FVIPSA and VAWA funding sources specifically. Those are the two main funding streams that come to the state-certified domestic violence shelters that have such strong confidentiality requirements. It is also included in CJCC standards for the state-certified programs. And so just explaining what that looks like, and that we would risk losing funding if we were to breach confidentiality, in addition to it just not being ethical practice in serving survivors. And we do have, I will provide a link to our training website as well. We are recording this webinar, and it will be made available on that training website. We have a series of webinars, a 4-part series that addresses confidentiality. So if you'd like to learn more about that, that's available for you as well. Just have a question coming in, so I'm going to look at that for just a second here. This person's just saying that there is an FVIP in their community, but they don't currently have contact with them, and so looking forward to reaching out and contacting them to see. So that's a great point. You may be thinking, well, gosh, I know there's an FVIP in my community, but we don't have a contract to provide victim liaison services. They may be one of those programs that have been given permission to contract with a unique organization. Some of our more metro area counties may have multiple DV organizations that could be approved to be providing those services. And there's one case in particular where we have a victim liaison who works for a state-certified domestic violence program who provides victim liaison services to a large number of programs. So sometimes you have cases like that. So, but absolutely, I strongly encourage you to reach out to that program and say, hey, we're here. We understand what this role is, and we'd love to partner with you. Even if we're not doing this contract, we just want to meet with you and get to know you so that you know about our resources and the services we offer. That is a great thing to do. And maybe that relationship can be built moving forward. It's not much money, but don't forget that the participants who enroll in the FVIP have to make payments that go to you as the victim liaison to provide that service. So it can be at least a small stream of income. Another person is talking about defects cases between parents and children. Yeah, that's a complicated piece there. I would say if you're getting forms from, so just to clarify, are you saying that parents are being ordered to FVIPs because of abusing children?
Well, because the statute, this is Nikki, but because the statute does require crimes of family violence potentially, and because abuse, the Georgia statute includes violence between a parent and child as a Family Violence Act violation, many times judges or other organizations are requiring parents who have been abusive to a child to attend family violence intervention program, not necessarily understanding that this program is really geared towards addressing intimate partner violence.
Right.
So if that is a situation that you're seeing routinely come up, that is something that really, in terms of your coordinated community response, either through your task force or through your work, with the FVIP individually, that you go to the judge or to that referring agency and really talk about how that dynamic affects the group dynamic of the FVIP, and sort of process what's going to work best for your community in terms of responding to issues. Because it could be that the case originated as a defects case because of child abuse, but even if technically the child was the victim of whatever the reason was for getting the person there, that they're actually being referred because they know that, for example, the father is also abusive to the mother. So really having that conversation can open up some interesting work that can be done in your community.
Thank you, Nikki. Yeah, that helps me to understand what that could look like. I think we can relate to this because it's similar to someone being referred to a domestic violence support group for family violence. And that's most of the time not what a domestic violence support group is really focused on. It is focused on intimate partner violence. And the same is absolutely true for FVIPs. Just a conversation that your agency would want to look at having in your community. Thank you. That's a great question. And then, like I said, if you have these sort of complex situations going on in your communities where you're getting contact information for folks who have been, for the victims of folks ordered to FVIPs who you don't think belong in FVIPs, please reach out to the commission or to the coalition, and we can try to help you navigate the best way to handle that. Let's see. Okay, so let's go back to this question that we asked you earlier about the perception of FVIPs in the community. Do they work? What do you think? And I'll share my own personal experience with this, is that when I was working as a victim liaison, sometimes folks would ask me, well, do FVIPs work? And I had been told, I kind of had this belief that, people are court ordered to attend, and if they're court ordered to attend classes, then they're not really wanting to change. And so, no, they don't work. I'll just, again, my personal experience is once I got a chance to observe the classes, I did observe change happening. And so it changed my opinion on that. And one of our handouts that we've attached for you is some of the latest research that's been done on program efficacy. It's a complicated question. There isn't really a final conclusion on this on a national level. These are debates that many states are having about this, but we're bringing this up because it's important for you to self-reflect on where you're at with this, and what your beliefs are. And again, we want to partner with FVIPs. We want to be on the same side. And so it can be harmful to that relationship if we're out in the community saying these programs don't work, because that's not going to really encourage judges and criminal justice systems to order folks to attend them, and to support that coordinated community response. So we're not saying that, it's up to each of you to sort of make your own determination, and I encourage you to read this article that we've included for you, and that I'll include in the email as well, to kind of develop your thoughts on that and see where you're at. It's a national conversation. There isn't a simple answer, but it's definitely worth considering. And I, for myself, once I observed the classes, I had a much more positive impression of the potential for change from perpetrators, which gave me some hope. So another thing I wanted to put out there for our victim liaisons to consider is this idea of collusion. Collusion is a term that's used in a lot of the curriculum and training for FVIP facilitators. And when I was making this slide, I was realizing what a loaded word this is right now because of our current political environment. So when I say collusion here, I don't mean this sort of nefarious, double-handed collusion that we're hearing about right now. Collusion within the context of FVIPs looks a little different. And many times this can happen unintentionally on the part of a facilitator. Again, when you are working with the same group of people and they're coming to your class every week, human nature is to make connections with those people and to develop compassion for them and sympathy for them. And, those are all good qualities that we have as human beings. But again, your role as the victim liaison is to be mindful of victim safety and to be that victim's voice. And so you may see things, see examples of collusion in class. And what collusion is in this setting is a facilitator kind of siding with the abuser, validating his entitlement beliefs or behaviors, even if they don't mean to. So that could even be something as simple as just joking around too much, becoming too familiar, not having good boundaries, or more extreme examples of agreeing with a participant when he's, justifying his controlling behavior. That's going to be pretty rare. It's usually more subtle than that. And I think the more classes you observe, the more you'll kind of understand what this could look like. But this is a great example of once you've formed that relationship with the facilitator, you may have opportunities to say, hey, I was just noticing in this class today with this particular participant that he's super friendly, he's super engaged, but I'm a little worried that maybe he's showing up in that way to kind of not take accountability for his abusive behaviors. So just something to consider and to learn more about. I've included the link to the Duluth Models website, which is one of the major curriculums that a lot of FVIPs use, that maybe you could learn a little bit more about this concept if you're interested in it. So again, going back to this idea of consultation and feedback and being the voice of the victim. So if you're concerned that the FVIP isn't following the rules regarding their contract with you, if they're not communicating with you regarding violent or aggressive behavior or thoughts, especially thoughts of suicide or homicide from participants, if there are billing or contract or referral issues, or just other things that you think may be endangering victims, these are all things that you want to share your concerns with. And just, again, this is a relationship, so we're encouraging you to take your concerns to the FVIP first. Just try to have a conversation with them. A lot of times with our community relationships, we may say, well, this is just how they are, this is how it's going to be, and not try to address it directly. But part of your role in considering that victim safety is bringing these things to the attention of the FVIP. what we hear from FVIPs. So being aware, again, this is a two-way street. It's a relationship. So some of the frustrations FVIPs may have in their relationships with their victim liaison is, again, not having that consistent contact, saying, I send the form over, but it's never the same person who's doing the contact. I don't know who to reach out to. Sometimes they get frustrated because they don't really know if the attempts at contacts are being made. And again, that comes back to that confidentiality piece, that you can't provide them with reports saying, I contacted this person at this day at this time. But ideally, if you're building that relationship and you're having regular communication, that will be proof that you are holding up your end of the bargain, and will relieve some of that tension. We've talked about this, that lack of support or validation in the community. So thinking about your messaging around FVIPs, and that they don't have the same access to training or collaboration opportunities. I can definitely say that the Commission is working hard to provide lots of training opportunities to FVIPs, and that's been a change in the last few years. But I know they will welcome any suggestions or invitations you have for them as well. Another complaint or just concern we hear is that, again, the piece around participants having to pay as part of their enrollment in the program. It's a one-time fee that gets sent to you, the program, for providing the victim liaison work. The purpose of that is to hold the participant accountable for their abusive behavior. It's saying that the system should not have to pay for you to contact the victim as a result of the perpetrator's choice to be violent. That's where that's really coming from. And so again, relationship building can go a long way in relieving some of the tension around that. And so what do you do when you have these concerns? Like I said, first try to address the concern directly with the program, ask for a meeting or schedule a call, refer to the rules. And again, your role is not to monitor them overall. We have the Commission for that. Your role is to be the voice of the survivor. And you absolutely should be expressing concerns around any safety issues that you see. But also to acknowledge that you may try to address your concern directly with the FVIP and still not get resolution. And if that's the case, to absolutely notify the Commission. Part of your role is helping them to do that monitoring, because victim safety is a huge part of what they're there for. And what you see and hear is incredibly helpful and important. So don't underestimate the value of sharing that information. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about best practices for reaching out to victims. And I realize we're running short on time here, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here. So as soon as possible after receiving notification of enrollment, you want to begin contacts with the victim, or attempts to contact. So the first step is usually to call a number if it's provided, but if there is not a number available, you can send a letter. And again, just to review, these are the points of contact. You're going to contact them when the participant is enrolled, if they're terminated for some reason, or if they complete the 24 weeks. You may also contact the victim if you receive other information regarding the participant from the facilitator. And of course, to hear the victim's concerns. So that would be if the victim is reaching back out to you for some reason. So let's go back to this piece about, let's say you get that form sent to you and it's missing a lot of information. So absolutely address that with the FVIP. But there are going to be cases where the couple has separated and the perpetrator, the participant, truly does not have this contact information. So if you feel like it's just that the FVIPs aren't really pressing for this, continue working with them on that. But you can also find other ways to locate victims. If you have a name, search your own Apricot or the new database when that gets put into place to see if they've ever accessed services from you before. You may have contact information for them already. If you have a good relationship with your local police department, you can reach out and see if they have contact information through a police report. If there was a protective order, can you get a copy of that? Any public records that you can access.
Yeah, I would just say, this is Nikki. When typically most participants in an FVIP group are there as a result of some sort of court action, and with that, there was somebody that was responsible for initiating that, whether that be the district attorney's office or solicitor's office or, somebody. So you can also consider those avenues to reach out, because they, in all likelihood, have had fairly recent contact with the victim in that case. So that was my easiest method of trying to find more recent contact information than even the police report.
Thank you. And the point here is that you want to be sure that if you are signing this contract and taking on this role, that you're prepared to do this legwork. It is time consuming, no doubt. But what we don't want to do is get into a routine of just getting these blank forms, saying, well, I can't contact this person, and sticking it in a file and not really going above and beyond to make that contact. Going back to those reasons of how unique this is, that we are reaching out and initiating contact with someone who may not otherwise know about us or ever think to call us. So some things, because again, this is unusual. It's kind of like telemarketing. So when you call, identify yourself. Hi, my name is Alexis, and I'm an advocate with fill in the blank. I'm calling today to let you know about Mr. Smith's enrollment in a family violence intervention program. Of course, you can find your own. You don't have to read that verbatim, but something along those lines. Explain what the FVIP is and what it's not. It's not a guarantee that his behavior is going to change or that he's going to be fixed. But explain, what the process is, the length of the classes, and what curriculum they cover. And then most importantly, you want to be providing information about your services. So not just your services as far as victim liaison work, but all of the other great programs that you have available, your support groups, your outreach office, your shelter, offering to do safety planning with them. Again, discuss the possible changes that may occur with a batterer, both good and bad, as a result of their attendance in the class. Just emphasizing it's not a guarantee of safety. They may not be reformed, but that they could see some change. Especially the longer they participate in the class, and how to react to that. I think one thing I always heard about from participants when I would observe a class is they'd say, I've changed, but she hasn't. She's still expecting me to be violent. And that's not the point. That's not, it's not, we don't want to turn around and again put blame on the victim, but just that's a normal human reaction to any sort of change is stressful. And so preparing them for that. Just taking some time to assess the safety of the victim and any concerns they have, providing other resources and referrals in the community, not just your services, and then having a conversation about when they would like to follow up. Is there any time they'd like to hear from you besides these predetermined points, completion or termination? So some things to consider is how often are you going to try to contact by phone before writing a letter? I know for me and my personal cell phone, if I don't recognize the number and they don't leave a message, I'm not ever going to answer the call. So how many times do you try to call and leave messages before you go ahead and write that letter? Are you going to include your business card in the letter, a brochure that tells more about your services? I think those are some best practices to do. What other strategies do you use for successful phone contacts? And how much information about domestic violence are you typically going to provide? And I think that's just going to be on a case-by-case basis and what that particular person would like to talk about. How often do you follow up? Like I said, do you schedule time? So some things to prepare yourself for are, what if the batterer, the participant, answers the phone? What if they're angry? I think that Jenny said this already, but the participants are informed when they enroll in the class that a victim liaison is going to be contacting their partner. So they are told that this is going to happen. But there could be a situation where they answer the phone and try to prevent that from occurring. And that's absolutely something you want to tell the facilitator has occurred. That's something that needs to be addressed. But in the moment, it's just about getting off the phone. You can say, I'm sorry, I got the wrong number. You don't have to engage with that person.
I would encourage you, and most of the domestic violence programs, their numbers do come up as blocked numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I would encourage you to make sure that you are making these initial calls, particularly if you know that the parties are still together, that you are calling from a number that cannot be returned call or traced, in case you do run into that sort of circumstance. But I used to just either say I had a wrong number or pretend to be some sort of a salesperson.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing to prepare yourself for, and you guys brought this up already, what if the victim is a minor, typically a teenager, where it's a family violence situation, not an intimate partner violence situation. And this would be handled the same way as if you had a teen calling your crisis line. When we talk about mandated reporting, when it's a teenager and there's teen dating violence, for example, that usually only triggers mandated reporting if you feel like the parents are being neglectful in protecting that teen from their dating partner, not the dating itself, the dating violence itself. But just I encourage you to talk with your supervisor about what your policies and procedures are around engaging with minors in this way. So some common challenges, again, this is a phone call versus face-to-face contact, cold calling versus having that initiated by the victim. Some other things you might hear are that they have reconciled and everything is just fine, or that the relationship is ended and that they don't have contact anymore and that they've moved on. And both of those things, again, we're going to work with the victim where they're at, so that we're not going to force them to engage with us any more than they want to. But just saying, I certainly understand and I don't want to take up your time. Just want you to know that I'm here for you if anything changes. And just so that you know that we're here and what services we offer is really the point of your contact.
I'll say also on either of those reactions that you're getting, it also is a good opportunity to ask the victim if they'd still like you to follow up with updates about his progress.
Yes.
Because even if they have, regardless of what the circumstances are, they still would, in all likelihood, want that information to confirm what they're already doing.
Absolutely. Yep. Another thing to be prepared for is if the victim asks for information or advice about couples counseling. That is not something we typically recommend when there has been intimate partner violence. Most FVIPs are telling their participants that they could get counseling, but that's separate from the FVIP. The FVIP is not counseling. It's an accountability class. But that's not to say that that participant couldn't benefit from counseling. It would just need to be a separate thing. But we're not really here in that capacity to give information or referrals to couples counseling specifically. And I would just encourage that person to consider waiting to have couples counseling until the participant has completed the FVIP. We can't, of course, make them not do that, but that would be something a conversation I would have. And then, you may encounter folks who say, doesn't think that she's in danger, doesn't need services. Again, that's fine. It's, again, like Nikki said, just saying, these are the points at which I need to contact you. Just, is that something that would be helpful to you? Just a reminder that as with any work we're doing with survivors, to use healthy communication skills. Again, you might get folks who are like, why are you calling me? I didn't ask for this, and hang up the phone. So we just want to maintain our empathy, our respect, speak slowly and clearly, listen, and ask open-ended questions when possible. Following that empowerment, victim-centered model, letting them lead the process, offering support without judgment or guilt, pointing out danger indicators while also respecting the victim's perspective. We're not there to convince them that they're in danger, but just to let them know what we're seeing and hearing, and to plant those seeds to encourage that person to see us as a support and a resource. I think we've covered this pretty well about confidentiality. Again, FVIP participants don't have confidentiality rights, but victims are protected. So that exchange of information is not a two-way street, and you would still need a signed release before sharing any specific identifiable information about the victim, beyond, of course, their name and the information that the FVIP already has. So again, just reiterating, it's all about the relationship. And there are multiple relationships in this arrangement. There's the relationship between the victim liaison and the FVIP. There's the relationship between the victim liaison and the victim. And then there's the overall relationship of the FVIP, the victim liaison, and the community at large. And these are all important pieces that go into making this process work. So these are some additional resources: the Commission's website, our training website, and the Duluth Models website. Like I said, I'll be emailing these slides to you, so you can have access to these. And this is our contact information. So we are at the end of our time, but we absolutely have time to hang out for a minute if you have any questions or comments. So feel free to type those into the chat box. If you do, we'll take a minute to check for those. Do you guys have any?
I will just say on the attachments and that are included in here, and then what Alexis will be sending out, that these are just samples.
Mm-hmm.
You can certainly change these, modify them to whatever works with you and the FVIP. You can see from the informational forms that this has a lot of information. That was, at the time, very helpful because you might get some pieces, and those might be the pieces that help you connect to the victim. But it certainly is a lot of information, and that may not work for you or the FVIP. Mm-hmm. So really talking amongst yourselves about what their process is and what's going to be best, that's going to get you just the information that you'll find helpful.
Thank you. All right. Well, we just appreciate you joining us today for this webinar. We hope that you've learned so much about your role as a victim liaison and even more about family violence intervention programs as well. And we hope to see you all next time for our next training. Thank you so much.